Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope that at some point I can meet you all in person when this is all done and over. So this is joint work with Atif Mian and Amir Sufi. Let me give you sort of brief motivation for what we do in the paper. So basically, in recent years, we have had many microfinance papers and macro papers in general using kind of regional specifications to estimate the effects of different policies and shocks. And we know those are, of course, very important to understand the effects of those shocks and policies. But at the same time, from a kind of macro perspective, those have kind of the drawback that are essentially partial equilibrium effects. And so if we think about from the perspective of macro and trying to understand the effects of these policies being implemented sort of at scale at the level of the macroeconomy, having partial equilibrium effects as our guidance in a sense is a little bit troublesome, because the sort of full effect of these shocks depend not only on partial equilibrium effects, but the GE sort of interactions that they generate throughout the economy to kind of shape the final effect. So this difference between the total effect and the partial equilibrium effect is what we are calling general equilibrium multipliers. Let me also say the paper is kind of currently undergoing a little bit of a mutation. So we are adding some things that I'm going to show you later on, and we are sort of tailoring more a little bit the paper towards estimating credit multipliers, which is sort of the G multiplier in credit markets. But the general idea is the same. You have a shock, you have a total effect, and then you have sort of the difference between the partial and the total being this G multiplier that we are calling, okay? And the idea in this paper is to propose a methodology to estimate these G multipliers. We're gonna argue that this methodology has some sort of advantages. First, that is, you're gonna see, it's gonna be relatively model-free. This by no means implies there's no theory, there's no model, there's anything. So there's theory, there's models, and so on. What we try to stress with this is that we are not going to rely on a particular structural model to estimate these G multipliers. In particular, we're not going to even rely kind of on a handful of these models. So there's going to be a class of models under which this is going to deliver sort of consistent estimates. And that's what we mean by relatively model-free. The other thing that we think is sort of interesting from this is that this is going to allow us to test specific structural models. So if you now have a structural model that you think explains a little bit these sources of amplification or dampening and so on, you could use potentially the estimates that we have here as kind of restrictions or tests to see whether the model that you wrote down actually complies in a sense with those estimates. And finally, and this is something that we're gonna sort of not stress too much in comparison to the previous two things, but we're still gonna leave the notation sort of open in a sense. We think there are a wide range of possible applications for what we have. And so when we get to estimation, you're gonna see that actually we're using a notation that's a little bit sort of agnostic in some sense in terms of the things that we're looking at, so that you know, people doing maybe other working in other fields could see, oh, my setup fits in this set of assumptions, and they could potentially use them. Sorry. Okay. So let me give you sort of the main idea right now, and then we're gonna kind of fill in the details as we go through. So let me, to illustrate, use a very simple version of a Kiyotaki-Moore 97 economy, a regional version of that economy, where instead of having an infinite horizon, you have two periods, and then you have a lot of regions. And suppose that in each of these locations, you have one matched pair of a banker and an entrepreneur. And as in the regional economy, the entrepreneur wants to invest in an asset, which is land, in order to produce in the following period some output, some fruit, some consumption good with that asset, okay? So we know that if in this economy we introduce a sort of great supply shock, so suppose bankers for some reason become better at monitoring the loans that they grant to entrepreneurs or something along those lines, then what we know is that on impact, these entrepreneurs which are credit constrained are going to kind of enjoy those extra that extra borrowing that they can now make from the bank, and they're going to take on those funds. So this is going to be kind of the initial effect of this shock. But we also know that the next thing that they're going to do is go to kind of the asset market, in this case, the land market, to increase sort of their holdings of the asset, right? They're so productive tomorrow, they want to invest more, so they get more credit granted, they go to the market, they increase their demand of the asset. All of the entrepreneurs do this at the same time. So what's going to happen is that the price of land is going to go up, and that's going to feed back into their balance sheets. They are already holding a little bit of the asset, so a larger price is going to increase sort of the they're going to experience a capital gain. It's going to increase sort of the net worth that they have. This effect is going to further reduce their credit constraint. So now it's going to be a further round. You have higher net worth, you're going to be able to borrow more, and you're going to go back again to sort of the land market to increase your demand even more. All entrepreneurs do the same thing, prices go up even more, and so we get this kind of feedback between the prices of the assets and the credit limits of entrepreneurs. So this initial effect, the kind of first thing that I mentioned, is what we would call the partial equilibrium effect. This interaction between credit limits and the prices of the asset, which is the original intuition. So the original paper had infinite horizons, and these interactions were playing kind of intertemporally and so on. Here in this economy, they are kind of playing regionally across agents in the space instead of kind of across time, but the intuition is exactly the same. And so this feedback loop kind of puts a wedge, in a sense, between the final effect of the shock with respect to the initial that we're calling partial equilibrium effect, okay? So in terms of estimation, so this is kind of the setup. We have this partial equilibrium effect, we have this Gini multiplier. What can we say in terms of trying to estimate these things? So we know that if we have some variation across these locations, we can estimate the partial equilibrium effects with the usual cross-sectional specifications that these papers use, right? What we also know is that in those specifications, usually these G interactions get differenced out. So we don't recover sort of this feedback loop that I was referring to before. Those drop out from the equations, and we are kind of left only with the partial equilibrium effect, with initial effects of the shocks, okay? So what is the idea in this paper? How are we going to partially, in a sense, overcome that? I'm going to say exactly what I mean by partially in 2 slides, or in 2 iterations of the picture. So the idea is the following. Many of these papers actually have an empirical regularity that they are using for some other things actually already, but that for these G multipliers turn out to be very powerful, which is that the economy that they are looking at is actually not the one that I have here in the picture, but it's a little bit different. It's an economy like this, where we have a segmented asset market. So we have some of the entrepreneurs trading in one asset market, some of the entrepreneurs trading in another asset market. So we kind of can think about the economy instead of as a group of islands, essentially, where in this case, I and J can trade in one land market, but they cannot buy or sell land on the other land market, and the same holds for K and M, right? So if this is the case, and we have the cross-sectional variation as we had before, we can still estimate the partial equilibrium effect, so nothing has changed in terms of that. What changes now is that if this variation also translates in some variation at the regional level, so at the level of the island, we can now estimate the effects of these shocks at least at the island level. And from the specifications of these 2 estimates, we can actually now difference out the effect of the G multipliers that are going to happen within the island, which is sort of this feedback loop that I was referring before. It's not happening at the national level, it's happening at the regional level. And so if we can estimate sort of very detailed micro specifications on a first stage to estimate some kind of partial equilibrium effect, and then we have some meaningful level of aggregation of which we can capture these other effects, then from the difference we can get at the G multiplier that I was referring to before. Of course, you might be already thinking probably, well, what if there's a third market, a national market that operates at the national level? Then what's going to happen? Well, of course, we're going to miss some of the G interactions. So this is not going to mean that we're going to capture all of the G interactions that we have, in a sense, with this specification. But we still think this is very interesting in the sense that many of the policies and shocks that we think about, we tend to think many times that they happen at the sort of highest level of aggregation possible. And actually, many of those happen at lower levels of aggregation. And those are still as meaningful and as important for us to understand how the macroeconomy works. And many of the models or the theoretical sort of contributions that we have load on kind of these mechanisms that actually don't operate at the sort of national level or the highest level of aggregation possible. So it's not going to be something that's going to allow you to estimate the G multipliers at all levels of aggregation, but it's still, we think, something very interesting. And in particular, as I'm going to try to argue, for the great multipliers case, is going to be relevant as well at this level of aggregation. So this is kind of the if you have any, yeah.
Can I ask you something? This is Federico from the central bank.
Yeah. Hi, Federico. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi. So then it kind of becomes very critical how you define markets, right? Like the level of aggregation that you're doing the exercise. It's kind of all it's going to boil down to sort of how you discipline that decision. And I guess, is that something you're going to go into details, or you're going to follow the literature there, or what's the strategy with respect to that?
Right. No, I'm going to give you some details on that. And I'm going to provide, I would say, a good amount of detail of how things go wrong when you kind of mess up these things. For the applications I'm going to show you, I'm going to argue that this is not such a big concern, but I'm definitely going to spend some time on this. And that's completely right. How you define markets and how you think about the whole setup is going to be very important for the G multipliers. What you might not be expecting maybe at this point is that actually if you are interested on the partial equilibrium effects alone, that's going to be important as well. And that I'm going to show you also some detail on that. So yeah, so you're completely right. All these things are kind of very, very important.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So if anybody has any other question, feel free to interrupt whenever you want. Okay, so we're gonna level up kind of these markets, some type of market segmentation and some exogenous variation at the bank and at the regional level in our case, because we're looking at credit multipliers, but essentially some source of exogenous variation as well. So those two things are the sort of things that are gonna allow us to do these things. And as Federico was mentioning, the market segmentation is gonna be very important. So instead of having particular empirical design for this paper, and given that we are kind of stressing this sort of angle of these ideas being a little bit more general, what we do is we actually grab different empirical designs from the literature. I was saying that these papers already have these empirical regularities, which again, they are using for some other purposes. So we think this is kind of an ideal setup to actually look at many examples and try to measure these G multipliers in different frameworks. And so we are working on a third one. I'm going to show you two. Now, one is based on the Dimaggio Carmani's 2017 Review of Financial Studies paper, where they use the anti-predatory lending laws across US states. And the other one is going to be Atif and Amir's paper on credit housing speculation, which also, this is nice in a sense that these two examples allow us to kind of look at both the kind of run up to the Great Recession from different angles. So this is going to be also another fun point in a sense, trying to compare. In principle, these G multipliers could be very different. I'm going to show you the results, but it's interesting in the sense that we are looking at sort of the same phenomenon from different angles in terms of variation. Just to give you a brief glance at the results that we get. we estimate, I don't know what was your prior, the microfinance literature emphasizes the amplification effects that financial markets might have for macro shocks a lot. And so naturally, I think you are expecting us to find some kind of amplification in a sense. What we find is actually a sizable amount of amplification. So almost 80% of the credit supply shocks measured at the regional level are coming from these G multipliers, from these G interactions in proportional terms. So I'm gonna, of course, go over the particular numbers and so on, but I think it's interesting that we find amplification first, and also that is kind of larger, maybe, I don't know, than you might have expected. So after having a kind of first look at the data, we're gonna step back for a second and think a little bit about, we have a lot of literature on why we might be observing this amplification. So we're gonna try to, in line with what I showed you a couple of slides ago, build a very stylized kind of regional Kiyotaki-Moore model, particular model, to see how amplification behaves in that framework, and if the kind of Kiyotaki-Moore idea can give us an amplification that can explain, in a sense, what we find in the data. And so the model is going to be useful for thinking about the amplification, but then we're going to take it kind of a step further, because we are also going to ask, in a sense, the model, okay, so if these were sort of the type of mechanism that is generating amplification that we observe in the data, then how should this amplification behave along different margins? And so the model is going to have some predictions on how the amplification should behave. And so let me not get into details on what those predictions are. We're going to go over in detail when we go through them all. But then we're going to, with these predictions, come back to the data and actually check whether the predictions are satisfied. And for the applications that we have so far, they are satisfied. Okay, so the model is going to kind of serve a little bit two purposes, and it's also going to inform very heavily sort of all of the empirical strategy I'm going to cover actually before, because I want to show you the numbers as quickly as possible. So the model is going to play sort of a sort of large role, and as I'm going to emphasize when I reach there, this model is going to serve as some sort of motivation for these effects, and I'm going to argue that deviations from these models are also going to sort of deliver the same empirical strategies, the same predictions, and so on. And so this is where we think about this as more kind of looking at a class of models where we have this Kiyotaki-Moore mechanism at the core, more than this particular model that we wrote down. But I'm going to sort of talk more about that later. And given this, there are probably kind of two sides of the same coin that you can think about this. So these results kind of give you these very specific tests for structural models, in the sense that, as I was saying before, now if you write down a model that gives you this amplification, in principle, it would be nice not only that the model gives you the amplification that we observe in the data, but also that it behaves in the way that we kind of document in these different specifications in these different applications. So you can look at these as kind of providing further tests, in a sense, of moments that these structural models should match. At the same time, it's kind of adding identification and external validity to the original papers, which they were not kind of paying attention to amplification on how it would behave or change under different conditions. And actually, the sort of identification arguments that they make lead to estimates that kind of line up with the predictions of a sort of stylized Kiyotaki-Moore mechanism would predict that this would behave. So these are kind of two aspects or implications, in a sense, and maybe if you're more theory inclined, you prefer the first one. If you're more applied, you like more the second one. But I think both kind of come out of this. So as I was saying, the estimation ideas are probably general. So this is where we don't go full in, but we try to kind of hint at these other potential applications. So our setup, if you, and I'm going to get into that very quickly, but if you think about labor markets, you know, with commuting zones, and you think about workers or firms, that's going to be very similar to our sort of regional variation with banks at the kind of micro level. And so if you can sort of make the exogeneity assumptions that we are making, probably that's the same kind of type of results would go through. If you're thinking about fiscal multipliers and state level spending, you might also kind of think about some of the effects that we are estimating also being meaningful, the specifications there. Okay, so let me skip the lead review so that I can actually get into the details. So the plan is, as I was saying, first to show you a little bit the estimation part. This is gonna, so at some point I'm gonna ask you to be patient in a sense, because some of the things are going to be very intuitive from the model, but maybe not if I show it to you right away, which is what I'm gonna do. But then when we get to the model, some of those things or concerns might kind of be eased in a sense when we look at the model. This is gonna allow me to very quickly show you some numbers, some sort of great multipliers. And this is where, after that, we're gonna kind of pause and take a step back, think about the mechanism, go to a model deeply, and so on, and then derive these other predictions so that we can go back to the data and actually look at these other predictions. Okay? Any question so far? Okay, so let me get into the setup. So again, I as I was before, gonna try to have this as general as possible. So I'm gonna work with Y, I, and N. In our case, Y is gonna be our outcome, it's gonna be great. I is gonna be a bank, and N is gonna be kind of a geographical unit where this bank belongs. But you, in general, Y could be sales, GDP, you know, other variables. You could think about workers for the cross-sectional units. You can think about something I will go back at some point, which is, so the N, which is this geographical unit to which the bank belongs, is some kind of grouping in general, right? So it's some way of kind of grouping the cross-sectional units that we have in our sample together. And this could be based on geography, but it could also be based on some other sort of conditioning variable or conditioning variables, and sort of the kind of same ideas would apply. So I'm going to touch a little bit more onto this later on. For this part, I'm going to work with a continuum of cross-sectional units and a discrete number of groups, and at least, so I don't know if you see, do you see the box at my right hand, or you just see the complete slides? Okay, so you see the cap T greater than 2 there. Great, okay, so we're going to work with at least 2 time periods. So this is going to be tailored more to particular setups in which we don't have a very long panel, right? So this is gonna, so think about T being rather small, actually. So think about being cap T being 3, 4, 5, something like that. So the results are not going to depend on cap T going to infinity. I'm gonna sort of lay out a little bit of that intuition later on and connect it to other papers. So note that we have kind of 2 levels of aggregation here. So we have sort of the regional level. Again, this could be any grouping, but in our case, it's going to be the regional level, so where only some of the cross-sectional units kind of belong. And then we have sort of the aggregate level to which all of the cross-sectional units belong, right? This is another kind of easy thing to sort of think about, an easy generalization. You could think about having many sort of layers in the same sense that I said, you could have many grouping variables to make the conditioning. It's not hard to imagine that you could have sort of many levels of aggregation, and then you're going to measure sort of the G effects at different levels of aggregation. Sorry. Sorry, do you hear me? You hear me well?
Now we hear you. We lost you for a second, but now we hear you.
Sorry.
We see the slides too.
No? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you, and we see the slides.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry. For some reason, my headphones disconnected and connected to my cell phone. I don't know why. So now I turn off the Bluetooth of anything that I have laying around me, so this doesn't happen anymore. Sorry about that. So
can I ask you something in the meantime? The very
sure,
quick question.
Yeah.
For these
Yeah,
general
sure.
equilibriums to play a role, don't you need a T that is sufficiently large to capture the second round, third round effects?
Right. So that's a very good question. So I'm going to get into the connection with that in a second. But so the description that I did before in terms of the rounds of interactions and so on, those all happen kind of simultaneously, right? So I was kind of describing them sequentially so that we can build an intuition on those effects. But think about those as having sort of happening all together at once, right? But it is true that as you start increasing the level of aggregation and at the level at which you want to measure these effects, you naturally fall into having needing sort of a very long time series. At least that's my view most of the times. If you don't want to impose a lot of structure, of course, right? So you could instead impose a lot of structure and you don't need that. So you are completely right in that respect. I'm going to touch a little bit onto that. But so what I would say at this point is, first, all those things happen simultaneously. Second, we are not going to be sort of aspiring to get all sort of to the aggregate level, for example, here, right? So we're going to be, as I was saying, happy to stay at kind of a middle level of aggregation. Okay.
Sorry, I have a related question, and Sucharledi here from the central bank also.
Yep.
Because I think
nice
in order to take this as a simultaneous effect, it's not necessarily a restriction that you impose on the horizon, or I mean on the number of periods, but certainly on the length of the periods. So I mean, this assumption is more credible the longer the size of each of these periods you consider.
So usually these are 4 or 5 years. So yeah, you need to allow for some time for these things to happen, but you don't need, if you're not going or aspiring to go all the way, you don't need a tremendously large time series. So in a typical example, think about, I'm going to use a difference which is 2000 to 2006, or you can think about the run up to the Great Recession, in the early 2000s, and so that's kind of the other papers have used kind of the span of the Great Recession, so it's 2 or 3 years. So this is kind of the type of framework that I have in mind. I don't know if that actually answered your question.
Yes, exactly. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be interested in see which is going to be an instrument or a shock. So this is any source of exogenous variation. It's going to be, think about it as either sort of truly randomized or being exogenous conditional unobservables. So, and this is kind of the first part in which maybe you're going to have to wait a little bit to the model to kind of be more comfortable with this, depending on how you look at this. But we're gonna assume at this level of generality that Y is determined by a kind of joint equilibrium process. It's gonna have a partial equilibrium block, which is gonna operate at the unit I level, and it's gonna have a G block that is gonna operate at the regional and aggregate levels. So it's gonna be the G block kind of split into two. Okay. The specification for Y at this point is going to be this equation that you see here, which has the instrument or a shock that we're interested in. And it has two, I'm going to call them prices, but this could be anything. And one, the key sort of part is that one operates at the regional level and one at the aggregate level. So the regional one, think about it as being the price of land in the region or the local wage in the labor market or something along those lines. And the aggregate equilibrium object, think about it as being an interest rate, an exchange rate, I don't know, aggregate investment, something that operates clearly sort of at the national level, okay? These two things could be vectors in general, and nothing would change. And this is kind of going to the grouping thing that I was mentioning before, but I'm going to take them to have the simplest possible framework to be scalars, and I'm going to abstract from any dynamics and so on. I'm going to focus on identification, and so we could add some dynamics, and these areas wouldn't change. So the coefficient on Z, that's what I'm going to call the partial equilibrium effect. I'm going to call it the partial equilibrium effect because it's going to measure the effect of C on Y, holding constant both the regional and the aggregate price. Okay. Of course, if we are already working with some level of aggregation, this PE effect is going to already have some G interactions. I'm still going to call it a partial equilibrium effect because I'm holding constant in my setup the regional and the aggregate price. Okay. And this is the second time where probably the model would be useful at this stage. But again, I'm going to work with a more intuitive concept here or approach here, which is I need to say something about the regional and the aggregate price. What I'm going to say is that the regional price is going to depend on the other Z's from within your group. Okay, so basically to determine that in equilibrium, I'm going to need to know sort of what's the other C's within your group. And intuitively, that's what's going to be relevant sort of for determining that equilibrium object at sort of the middle level of aggregation. And in my case, at the aggregate level, I'm going to say all of the C's in the economy are relevant for determining that. Okay, and so I'm going to specify basically these two equations for the regional price and for the aggregate price. Okay.
Andres?
Yeah.
Hey, so this is Federico again. So related to my question before, I guess the issue is that I'm thinking is that first, the definition of the market or like the unit of aggregation is a function of like what are the assets or what sort of the G mechanism in particular that you have in mind, right? Like it depends on which is sort of, if you're thinking about if it's land, then yeah, maybe, you know, geography is kind of a good like states and maybe a good dimension, but if it's something, it's another type of assets that it's not land, then, you know, the market definition is gonna probably change. And then the second thing is sort of if you have heterogeneous effects of those G effects, right? So different people have different holdings of different assets, so the portfolio is heterogeneous, then those G effects are going to be soaked up into the partial equilibrium effect, I guess, right? Some of that heterogeneity might be soaked up there, or that's not correct.
Okay, so first question, yes, completely. And I'm going to get into that in a couple of slides
Okay.
on terms of how this works. So I ask you to hold just a bit more, and maybe, you know, if it's not satisfying enough, we can come back. But I think it's going to be sort of addressing what you're mentioning. In terms of the heterogeneous effects, yeah, so, you know, here I am completely abstracting from that. Actually, in my job market paper, one of the main things was that having heterogeneous effects creates problems, but also offers the possibility for solutions when you have long time series and you can actually exploit them. So it's not that I don't like them, I like them a lot. It's just that with sort of very short time, very short panels, it's very hard to sort of deal with those. And depending on the assumptions that you make, you can get, okay, so I haven't worked out the details of this, so I'm speculating here. So don't take this, let's take this with a grain of salt. But I'm pretty sure depending on the sort of assumptions that you make, you can get different problems. So in what I'm going to show you, I'm going to abstract completely from those, and I'm working on a homogeneous effects framework. I think, you know, for having like 2 or 3 periods potentially, dealing with heterogeneous effects is very, very complicated. But yeah, this is my view, at least. It might not be correct, of course.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Andres, sorry. I would like to make you a question. So
Sure. Yeah.
This is
Carlos.
very similar to the social interaction models. So I think it's crucial that the network of the interactions for the general equilibrium effect must be predefined, right? Meaning you can estimate this as long as the network is predefined, and it is established, say, that I have the same impact on Ernesto Pasten, and Ernesto Pasten has the same impact on me, and so on, right?
So what I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna assume that is the case. But let me say, I'm not sure that is needed, as you say. Again, in the territory of speculation, I think there are some things that you can do, some flexibility to allow for that. But you have to maybe strengthen other parts of the identification assumptions that you have to make in order to make it work. So I wouldn't discard that for sure. But in terms of my presentation today, yes, I'm going to assume that. And actually, I'm going to relate a little bit with the question that Federico asked before on what would happen if we mess up with these things. That's coming in 4 slides.
Andres.
Thank you.
Andres.
Yeah.
Patricio.
Yeah. Yeah. Patricio.
Yes. So just a clarifying question to see if I understand. So
sure.
If I get some instrument with say a randomized control trial or something very exogenous in some sense, so I wouldn't expect to have sort of to find any general equilibrium effect in the sense of if I'm comparing aggregates, I wouldn't expect to find any differences at the aggregate level. Sort of in terms of in the equation in the previous slide, like the instrument is sort of completely orthogonal to the aggregate effects in some sense. So it's in some sense it's like running the experiment and then running the same experiment at the aggregate level. But I'm not, and so I'm not. So my question is whether that intuition is correct. I mean, it's like running the experiment at the unit level and then at the aggregate level. That's the part I don't get, where you get the aggregate effect identification from.
Right. I interpret your comment as meaning that if you do this in a very small subpopulation of the country, you won't get any aggregate effects, right? And that I completely agree. You should think about this as kind of a large-scale experiment. Of course, most of the times the questions that we are interested, we need to find ways of finding natural experiments at those levels, at those scales, in a sense. So think about this as kind of a natural experiment that you have identified. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, so my question, so let me rephrase it. So my question is whether the exogeneity in the instrument is required at the unit level and at the aggregation level you are interested for, or just at the unit level? That's my question, actually.
Okay, sure, yeah. No, I'm gonna ask for this exogeneity at both levels. I'm gonna actually have a particular sort of an explicit assumption on that. So give me just one moment, I'm gonna get into that. I just wanna fix quickly kind of some terminology so that, I talked about these G multipliers and so on, so that we are all on the same page in terms of the equations. So if we plug in the equilibrium process for the regional equilibrium object and we aggregate to the regional level, we get on top of the partial equilibrium effect for a relationship between Y bar and Z bar now, a layer of general equilibrium effects, which are very simple, the interaction of how the other Z's in your region affects the regional price and how the regional price affects you. So that's kind of what's going to determine this very simple framework. These sort of layer of general equilibrium effects are going to be included in this specification here. Okay. This is what I'm going to refer to as the G multiplier. And just again to fix terminology, I'm going to say when the P effect is positive, I'm going to say that there's amplification if this guy is positive. And I'm going to say that there's dampening if this guy is negative. And I'm going to sort of switch the terminology if the P effect is negative. Okay, so it's basically what I think we're expecting. If sort of measuring this gives you a larger effect than the impact, then we are having this amplification through these G effects when the impact is positive. Okay.
I have another
Same thing.
quick point. Sorry, this is Ernesto.
Sure.
this is probably contained in what you already replied, but probably we could put it together in a different way. My understanding that for implementation, you need an identification strategy for Z. But as you said in your reply to Patricio, many times we don't have a treatment that can be applied to everyone, and we only take some part of the total population in order to compute the effects. Think about exploring discontinuities, stuff like that. We don't take everyone who got the policy or the shock, just the guys who are in the margin. In those cases, can we still apply this? And if not, what are the requirements for identification of seed that we need to apply all of this?
So those are great questions. I think that if that's the case, and if the experiment is kind of very small, the problem is I'm going to be exploiting cross-sectional variation at the group level, right? So if you don't have many groups, I cannot do anything. If you give me two groups, it's not that there's no amplification, it's just that I cannot recover it from the data, right? So in those setups, what I would say is, maybe that sort of connects to previous questions. Maybe in those cases, it's more worth it to kind of try to exploit the time series dimension more. But you're probably going to need like very fine data. So that's why I'm a little bit skeptical, for this kind of setup. So I at the same time, I would say kind of the interest in terms of this paper is for more kind of macro type questions where we usually, if you identify something like this, it's affecting sort of a lot of cross-sectional units, a lot of groups, and so on. Of course, we could debate if the level of aggregation is correct or not, and so on, but it's not in general for the questions that we're interested in, something that's happening at a very small scale. So I wouldn't want to sort of get too much into these these other kind of treatments where they're more localized and so on. I don't have kind of a great answer for what I would do particularly there.
So with Andres,
okay.
Sorry, just a quick comment just on the answer to Nestor's question and my question. So
sure.
So again, my question is like, so if I can run an experiment that is exogenous both at the individual and aggregate level, so it's like running a huge RCT or something like that, that it's randomized at both levels, then I can always run a regression at the individual level and then just run it at the aggregate level and attribute differences at the aggregate level as a G effect in some sense. So I thought that so you were going to have you wouldn't need exogeneity at both levels, right? Because that is really hard to get even with natural experiments in some sense. Or maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
Right, yeah. So basically the point of the paper is the market segmentation, which I already stressed, but also these papers that we are actually applying, and you can probably think among other papers as well, are already making this both the market segmentation, in a sense, they are kind of, they display that empirical regularity, but are also making these exogeneity assumptions at both levels. And these papers are looking at this for some other reasons. I don't want to get into that on why exactly they are doing that. They are definitely not looking at G multipliers, and the interest on those papers is not looking at the G multiplier. Our kind of approach is to say, you have a setup where you have already argued for these identification assumptions. And if I pair that with that empirical regularity, I can actually, in this case, for example, in the applications of the credit markets, measure these credit multipliers. And I can test how the credit multiplier changes across different sort of dimensions of the data. And so I agree that in general, sometimes going sort of at larger levels of aggregation, the exogeneity conditions are more hard to satisfy. So this is not going to be, at least off the shelf, is not going to be something that you're going to be able to apply, blindly to any sort of applied, in a sense, paper that is sort of arguing for the more disaggregated exogeneity conditions. So yeah, we are basically going to work with papers that are already sort of arguing for both. Okay. Okay, so just a little bit more of terminology. This is the last one. So if I repeat that, I get at the aggregate level, I now do this with the aggregate equilibrium object. I get a third layer of GFX, which are going to be what I'm going to call the G multiplier at the aggregate level. Okay. The sum of the partial equilibrium effect and the G multiplier at the regional level, I'm going to call that the regional elasticity, and the whole sum of the three things, the macro elasticity, as it's usually the case. Note that this regression now is kind of a time series regression, right? I'm assuming I have a short panel, but now I get a relationship between YT bar and CT bar. So you can imagine potentially under some other assumptions that I'm not going to make, and particularly not relevant probably for the papers that I'm going to apply this, at least for the results I have today. You could do something if you had sort of a large time series to recover this third layer. Again, today this is small t, so we can't even think about sort of running this time series regression or doing anything with this. Okay. So let me quickly tell you the main idea, and then sort of touch upon these other things before going to the data. So the main idea of the estimation in this framework, I think, is very straightforward. So if we look at this equation here, I can already see that if I include a region by time fixed effects, when I estimate this equation, I'm going to be able to recover the partial equilibrium effect from this, the coefficient on Z. Okay. And if in this equation I include only time fixed effects, I'm going to be able to recover the regional elasticity from here. Okay, if I were able to do that. And so from the difference of the two, and actually this is how I'm going to define my estimator, so it's going to be the difference between these two guys, we can find some assumptions such that this is going to be a consistent estimator for the G multiplier. Okay. What are the assumptions? The grouping assumption, I'm going to get to that in 2 slides, but the exogeneity assumptions that you were mentioning before, I think there's nothing surprising here. So I'm going to ask for the first difference of the C's, the deviations from the within region average, to be orthogonal to the shocks. This is going to give me a consistent estimator for the PE effect. And then I'm going to ask for the regional averages of the Z's, the deviation now from sort of the grand mean of the whole economy, to be orthogonal to the shocks, the first difference. Okay. And that's going to give me a consistent estimator for the regional elasticity. And then from the two, we can actually easily show that my estimator for the G multiplier is going to be consistent for the true G multiplier. So these assumptions, as I was saying, are important. These papers kind of argue for these assumptions. There's this very crucial or important assumption in the background that I discussed, that we talked about before. And this is that in all of these manipulations that I did, we were kind of assuming all the time that I knew how to combine cross-sectional units I and J, that they belong to the same sort of group N together. And this is the question, I think, Federico, and the question about the networks and so on. So it's getting at this, okay? So this is crucial. It's very easy to show that, if you mess up this, you're gonna get biases all over the place in what I've shown you. So even though it seemed like a walk in the park, maybe, the results that I've shown you, it has this very kind of important assumption laying back in the background. So let me, what we do in this respect to kind of compare with sort of what would happen if this assumption is violated, is actually take advantage and compare the specifications that we run with some specifications that these applied papers many times run, that will allow us to kind of see both the comparison to kind of other specifications and also the consequences of sort of stepping out of this assumption. And these specifications are, here, many times people run specifications like this one, but only include a time fixed effect instead of a region by time fixed effect. So what would be the consequence of, in this equation, only having a time fixed effect? Okay, why is this kind of touching upon the theme of this grouping assumption, this is kind of assuming that there is nothing in between, in the middle, and you can show very easily that if you mess up the grouping, this is sort of the kind of biases that you're gonna get. It's a little bit different, but this allows us to kind of touch upon the relationship between these other specifications that people run all the time. And so really the sort of main message of this is in the third result, but the others are kind of to understand what's going on. But basically, suppose that you define your estimator as the difference between, so the same thing that you were doing before, but now you kind of mess up in a sense, and you don't use the partial equilibrium estimator that I had before. Use this one, which only includes the time fixed effect. Okay, what is the effect of doing that? Well, the resulting 3 says that there's going to be basically attenuation bias. You're not going to recover the whole G multiplier that you have in your data. And 1 and 2 kind of explain mechanically what's going on. So what 1 and 2 say is, 2 says, you know, your regional elasticity is still fine. What's happening is that you are messing up your partial equilibrium effect. I'm going to come back in a second to the intuition on that. 4 just says that what I've shown you before in this setup works well. So as I was saying before, you know, if you do what I've told you before in terms of the estimators, you still recover the full G multiplier. So this is a setup in which including, so using the hats in a sense, gives you the correct answer. If you mess up the first specification, you get attenuation bias, which is related in particular to the asymptotic variances of the variation of the C's at the regional level and the variations at the C's of the C's at the sort of whole economy-wide level. That's gonna sort of regulate how much of a bias we get. Let me give you the intuition for this in just one slide before showing you, before I want to show you kind of just to throw up some numbers in a Monte Carlo simulation to see how bad could this look like. So here I am simulating the C's. The first difference is as a normal shock at the regional level, and then some idiosyncratic shocks at the individual level. Okay. What I'm varying is how important is the regional component, which is this phi here that I have in front of this, and I'm sort of doing it for 3 different kind of measures of that importance. And then if you look at the last 2 columns, this is sort of the estimator of the G multiplier at the regional level, and it should be 1. So this is what I'm simulating with. So the partial equilibrium effect is 1, the regional is 2, so the multiplier should be 1. And you can see already, even with a sort of low level of phi, we already have sort of a considerable amount of bias. And these sample sizes are chosen so that you know, 50 means you're probably using state level data. If you use MSA level data or commuting zone level data, you would use like something or 300 or 700. So this is something somewhere in between 500. So you see already here large sort of bias from doing this, and as phi increases, you get larger biases. The column 3 and 4 shows that the regional elasticities are consistent, as it should be in what I've shown you. And so the first 2 columns show that actually the problem is coming from messing up, in a sense, the partial equilibrium effect. So let me get at the intuition of why that's going on. So basically in this setup, we can show that the partial equilibrium effect is not captured by this estimator because there's a kind of part of this G multiplier that kind of filters through the estimation in the first stage. And that's sort of then messing up the estimation of the partial equilibrium effect. And going to something that I was mentioning before, you know, when you look at this, you might first say, well, this is not exactly, you know, great or what I wanted, but I'm still learning something from running these regressions and getting at these estimators and so on. So the thing is even more kind of problematic here in a way, in a sense that this effect that you are going to recover is not a meaningful intervention in this type of models. So it's not that you can attach this, to something and still, in principle, think that you have, or it's very debatable the extent to which you have learned something, in a sense, from recovering some of these. So this is what I was saying before, that even if your interest only lies on the partial equilibrium effects, this is kind of troublesome on that dimension as well. So it's troublesome in terms of giving the attenuation bias for the G multiplier. It's also troublesome only if you're interested only in the partial equilibrium effect. And just to give you an idea, in our applications, we would get like between 15 and 25% of our estimation bias in the partial equilibrium effect. And because we have such huge sort of G multipliers in terms of, in proportional terms, we would only get between 5 and 15% attenuation bias. Okay, so now I'm ready to show you some numbers. Maybe if you have some questions on the setup or on this last part on the connection with other specifications and so on, it's a good time.
Yes, Andres, Patricio here.
Yeah.
Quick question. So just to understand, how do you defining general equilibrium effect? So because it is the difference between the partial equilibrium effect and the regional effect, I understand that you have two. So general equilibrium effects consider both like compositional effects and feedback or feedback effects, right? Because like the partial equilibrium effect, it's at the unit level, right? So you're not considering like different sizes or stuff like that. That is going to show up in your general equilibrium effect. But you're also going to get like feedback effects, like price effects or stuff like that, right? So that's my question. So general equilibrium effects is you're capturing both. It's not like we think in general equilibrium in macro models that it's, what's coming from some sort of price effect in some sense. Is that right or wrong?
So if I understood your question correctly, I think that, so I'm assuming homogeneous effect. So any composition effect, I think, would be kind of collapsed with the standard G effect that you would estimate, regardless of the econometrics that you would sort of define in these models. Maybe I didn't get your question correctly, but that would be my thought on that. Maybe we can talk more about this later on, but I see it as the standard kind of G effect, in a sense, that you would define in these models. If I think about composition effects, I would tend to think they would sort of show up if I assume some heterogeneity and some exposure. I don't know, get into the Bartik type things and so on, which I am sort of abstracting at this point here, but maybe I'm wrong. We can talk more.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
Andres?
Yeah.
Hi. I have a question related to your empirical model, especially on how you're placing here let's say the spatial dependence or the spatial effects. If I understood correctly, from the beginning or from assumption, you are ruling out these general equilibrium effects or these spatial or grouping effects from the dependent variable. No, it's like it seems to me like that your empirical specification is like the empirical specification of Mansky in the reflection problem, but just assuming that the spatial effects or grouping effects comes from the exogenous regressor. Is that correct, or is like we should assume your empirical specification as a reduced form, and what you are capturing or the way you're controlling for these general equilibrium effects is a combination of both, from exogenous spatial dependence and from endogenous spatial dependence? That's my.
That's a great question. So my answer was going to be the second one, actually. So I was going to tell you, I think about this as, of course, I know peer effects are interesting and so on. I think those are much more harder to sort of estimate. So you can think about what we are doing here as kind of the reduced form of those, which is going to mix kind of everything together. And I'm not going to be able to say anything about sort of this first part that went into the mix in a sense. But yeah, in principle, in this paper, we're not interested in that. So that's fine. But yeah, does that make sense?
Just to understand how we interpret these
Sure,
effects.
sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question, and I completely agree with your second. That's how I think about this.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me show you some numbers. So this is I'm going to show you first some numbers, and then I'm going to go to the model. This is working through the empirical application of the Maggio and Kermani's specification empirical design. They were looking at the states that had anti-predatory lending laws, and in 2004, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is one of the agencies that regulates national banks, enacted this preemption rule that basically barred the application of these laws to national banks and their mortgage subsidiaries operating there. So basically, all of a sudden, national banks were not subject to these rules anymore. And the point of their paper is to actually show that this is the first part of their paper is to show that this is a sort of great supply shock. Okay, since the policy happens and it's only relevant for APL states, and after 2004, there's going to be a triple difference strategy. Okay, and this is what they use, and this is exactly what we're going to use. So we're going to try to kind of load on their setup full on, and then look at what multipliers we get and so on. But the setup is exactly what they have. On the data terms, there's nothing particularly new or interesting here. We are using the HAMDA data set. We're going to mix it with the call reports data as well, but there's nothing very special about the data we're going to use. To tie the specification to what I've shown you before, the variable of interest here is going to be this triple interaction, which is whether we are an APL state or not, whether it's after or before 2004, and whether you are regulated by the OCC or not. And so this is going to serve as my Z, INT that I had before. And the beta 1 in this equation is going to be my partial equilibrium effect in terms of what I had before. Okay. And when I go to the regional level regression, I'm going to use the same thing. I'm just going to replace the OCC indicator by the average of the loans originated by OCC lenders in 2003. So this is going to be sort of the regional measure of the shock that the authors use actually in their paper. And this is going to be our sort of regional elasticity. And we're going to use data from 2000 to 2006. Okay. So these are the results that you get. You go, you run these regressions, you get a partial equilibrium effect of 9%, okay? When you look at the regional effect, that is 45%. So when you do the difference between the two, in proportional terms to this regional effect of 45%, in proportional terms, that's 80% coming from these general equilibrium effects, from these G interactions. Again, the focus on their paper is not on the G multiplier. We're going to dive deeper now into this, but this is sort of the first approximation to show you sort of with real numbers in a specific example that the literature has used, how this great multiplier looks in the data. So we have amplification. As I was saying before, we have a sizable amount of amplification in a way, okay? So let me put now a little bit more of structure into these exercises, and I'm going to describe a little bit the model that we're going to use. Again, we're going to interpret this sort of softly as a class of models, but let me walk you through the main details. So this is an economy that's composed of different islands. We're going to have locations in each island with a matched pair of entrepreneurs and bankers, as I was saying in the intro with that very simple example. And we're going to have that entrepreneurs are going to need two kind of assets to produce. They're going to need land and they're going to need machines. These are going to be durable assets that are going to have sort of a main difference, which is land is going to be non-tradable, but machines are going to be tradable. Okay, so basically, if you are in land N, you can buy and sell land in that island. You cannot operate in the land market of N prime. However, you can buy and sell machines from location Y prime, whatever, from the market, from someone in island N prime. Okay, and you're gonna see, you already probably are suspecting this is gonna be sort of useful for determining the different levels of aggregation and so on through which these great multipliers are gonna happen. That's why we want these sort of different types of markets. The economy is a very stylized Kiyotaki-Moore world. So suppose instead of having infinite periods, collapse that to 2 periods, and instead of having only one sort of region in a sense, have many regions and many entrepreneurs and bankers in each region. The framework is going to be standard in a sense that entrepreneurs, they're going to start with some positive net worth. They're going to need some down payment to invest. And they're going to use all of their net worth towards the down payment in the asset. The bankers are going to have deep pockets, so they're going to be not interesting in a sense. They're going to just provide sort of all of the resources that entrepreneurs ask for, up to a credit limit. There's going to be sort of a credit constraint that the entrepreneur is not going to be able to borrow more than theta. Think about this as how good bankers are at monitoring or recouping sort of their loans and so on from entrepreneurs. So they are not going to be able to get more than theta of their income, the entrepreneurs. Okay, so very simple setup, nothing sort of too sophisticated. In order to sort of look at the amplification, let me start with a simplified version. Suppose there's no machines and we only need land to produce. Okay, if that's the case, this is the land demand of these entrepreneurs, which is, as usual, sort of the ratio of the net worth or the liquidity that entrepreneurs enter the period with over their down payment. The down payment is just the price of the asset minus what they can borrow from the bankers. And the net worth is just the assets, the value of the assets that they have, their income, minus the debt that they have. Okay? So from this, we already see that if we increase theta, we're going to have an increase in demand. Okay? What's going to be crucial is what's going to happen with this demand when the price increases. Is this demand going to go up or going to go down? So there are two effects here. So luckily, we have the usual downward sloping effect of demand curves, that when the price of the asset increases, we get a lower demand because the down payment increases. But now we have in this great constraint equilibrium, we have a second effect, which is that, as I was saying in the intro, the net worth of these entrepreneurs is going to increase. So if we have this net worth effect to overturn the down payment effect, we can easily show that we're going to have sort of strategic complementarities in this economy. We're going to get amplification in equilibrium. Okay, so the amplification that we might observe in the data coming from a Kiyotaki-Moore style mechanism would come from something like this in this model. Okay, and if we have the machines, the idea would be the same, and the intuition is the one that I sort of walk you through in the intro when we were talking about the feedback loops and so on. Let me quickly use this also when I was going through the sort of estimation. I said at some points, you know, you're going to have to sort of bear with me until we get to a model. So if we linearize this model around the great constraint equilibrium, this is the system that we get, which is almost exactly the same as the one that I've shown you in the estimation part. So now my Z is the theta that I have here, and we have a regional price and we have an aggregate price. The regional price is kind of the price of land of the local asset, because there's some interaction with the national market, some complementarity in production. It's not the whole price of land, so it's a modified price of land, but it serves the same purpose. The price of machines is kind of the aggregate market or aggregate price that I was referring to before. That's going to give us kind of the last layer of aggregation. But the system is exactly the same otherwise that I've shown you in the estimation part. So very easy to show in this setup. Given the assumptions that we have amplification at every layer of aggregation. The intuition, again, is sort of what I've shown you before, what we discussed many times, this feedback between prices and credit limits that sort of operates at every layer of aggregation that we have in this model. Let me, make one more point, which is, and this is going back to what I mentioned before about the class of models. So if you go back and you change things in the model as I've shown you, so you change the credit constraint, you change slightly the production function, so many things that you can change are going to give you the exact same system that I have here. So this is the sense in which, of course, it's not model free. We are paying attention in terms of what is the relevant asset, what is the relevant level of aggregation of that asset. So there's a lot of things that go into the identification assumptions and so on. It's not model free, but it's much more robust than grabbing a particular model and sort of estimating that particular model in the data, right? So this is the whole point of the robustness thing. So let me quickly, before going back to the data, go through
Andres?
Sort of, yeah.
Super quick, 15 minutes, a little bit less actually.
Okay, so let me go very quickly. So in this model, the price of land is going to transmit the GFX at the regional level. The machines market is going to transmit the GFX at the aggregate level. One question that we might ask to the model is what happens if we shut down one of these markets? Suppose we only have the machines market. Well, what's going to happen is that we're only going to estimate the GFX at the aggregate level if we could. The GFX at the regional level is going to be 0, and we're going to get sort of the same answer when we run the regional specifications. And so the intuition for this and how we're going to take it to the data is not this extreme sort of version that the model is kind of illustrating with. It's more than if I look at, for a given amount of amplification, if I look at regions that tend to be more open, I'm going to capture less of those GFX in my specification. So I should observe if there is amplification, I should observe lower levels of amplification in those specifications, okay? So I'm going to take this as an approximation to the data. If you do the opposite exercise, you here conclude that my regional elasticities are the macro elasticities. You are just running sort of, you have the n copies of the same macroeconomy, you're running sort of an aggregate regression, you are recovering the macro elasticity with our setup. Of course, we don't think this is sort of the relevant case for our setups, and probably there are not many cases where this is relevant, but this is just a comparison kind of for completeness. The last exercise that I'm interested in is looking at what happens. All of the intuitions that I gave you are for situations like this, in which there is some inelasticity in a sense of the supply curve, so that when I increase the demand, there's an effect on the price, and that sort of triggers all of the further rounds in a sense of increases. So in this part, we get a multiplier, an amplification at the regional level. What if actually demand fell down in this part of the supply curve? So now I'm going to be able to meet this demand all with quantities and nothing with price. So the price is not going to need to react at all. And all of these mechanisms that I just sort of give you this intuitive explanation, I'm not going to go through. I'm not going to get any amplification there. Okay. Again, the model is very extreme. It has an infinite inelastic supply curve, which then turns into an infinite elastic supply curve. We're going to take this more as an approximation, meaning that if I tend to look at places where the relevant asset is much more elastic, the supply of that asset is much more elastic, I should observe lower multipliers if this is sort of the mechanism that is generating these amplification effects. Okay? So let me go back to the example that I've shown you before. So columns 1 and 2 are the ones that I've shown you before, okay? What I'm doing in columns 3 and 4 now is splitting the sample and looking at places where only places where the relevant supply elasticity is very low. In this case, we are looking at sort of mortgage credits, and so this is the housing supply elasticity is the crucial sort of elasticity. So we are looking at these places with a low housing supply elasticity. And there are many comparisons that are interesting. First, I gave you, and we could think about other models and other reasons, but I gave you good reasons to expect differences in the G multipliers. I didn't give you at this point good reasons to expect differences in partial equilibrium effects, right? If you compare columns 1 and 3, the partial equilibrium effects are almost identical. I'm going to show you now that for the other parts, it's a little bit different. It's almost identical, okay? So the partial equilibrium effects actually turn out to be not sort of changing across these lower elasticity places. When you look at now the multiplier, so here we are going from 9 to 45 in the places where we have very highly inelastic supply curve. We're going from 9 to 133. So the amplification increased tremendously in these places. And if you compare with the high elasticity places, the amplification gets sort of decreased tremendously. So you are going now from roughly 9 to 33. So the amplification, at least on this margin, not only kind of we get amplification, which we might be expecting because of the sort of theoretical models that we have on the microfinance literature, it also kind of behaves and lines up exactly what we would expect from a Kiyotaki-Moore style mechanism, right? If I repeat this, now I grab the places that tend to be more closed, and I compare them with places that tend to be more open. Again, the partial equilibrium effects don't seem to change at all. The multiplier increases tremendously. So it goes from 9 to 85, right? So again, the same pattern. And if I look at the high trade parts, the partial equilibrium effect falls a little bit, still kind of very much in line in terms of magnitude to what we had before. The amplification drops, okay? So let me quickly, just to show you another application. So the other application that we have right now is based on Atif and Amir's credit housing speculation paper. The idea of the identification there is that there was this run up where the private label securitization mortgage market started surging in the early 2000s. And the idea in that paper is that the banks that had a that relied more non-core non-deposit funding to fund their operations were better able to kind of switch and sort of take advantage of the PLS market much more quickly. And so what they use and what we're going to use here is as our Z is the NCL ratio of these banks. So basically the non-core liabilities ratios of these banks, thinking that these are the ones that could take advantage of this sort of rise in the PLS market. The CM bar is going to be the weighted average of the NCL ratios at the MSA level. So forget about, for a second, about the levels. If you now compute the partial equilibrium effect columns 1 and 2, and the regional elasticity in column 2, the multiplier again gives us amplification. If you look in proportional terms, it's also like the same amplification that we had before, which is kind of crazy in a way. So one is, I think, in proportional terms, 78%. The other one is like 80%. We were thinking about, of course, probably getting amplification. It turns out that it lines up sort of very closely in proportional terms. In terms of the levels, these are different, and we were probably expecting difference in levels and in proportional terms as well. We only got one of those. If I look across the low elasticity places, I still see a huge increase in the G multiplier. Again, the partial equilibrium effect doesn't seem to change much among those. If I look at the high elasticity places, again, the partial equilibrium effects almost stays the same, but the amplification gets dampened, so it gets reduced heavily in those places. And if I look at places that tend to be more close, also the amplification increases a lot. The partial equilibrium effect seems to be stable, and it decreases a lot in places that tend to be more open. Again, the partial equilibrium effect seems to be stable. So kind of to sum up what I've shown you, two different empirical designs. These assumptions that we were mentioning before had already sort of been defended, quote unquote, in those papers. We are sort of loading onto those, and we see that the G multiplier actually gives us that there is amplification in the data, but the amplification also behaves in the way that you would expect in terms of being consistent with this sort of Kiyotaki-Moore style mechanism. And this is kind of driving this back to so how do we interpret this? So first, if you write down a model, you have amplification that's nice. Maybe now you want to also match sort of this behavior of the amplification in the data. So you have kind of these further moments for how the amplification should behave, in principle, to be consistent with what we observe. The second one is probably this is sort of adding to the regional identification arguments in these papers, because under those, not only sort of you get the effects that they estimate, you also get sort of G multipliers that line up with the theory in sort of absolute terms, but also they behave in the way that you would predict if those mechanisms are the ones that are sort of driving that amplification in the data. So let me stop here. I think our 2 minutes, I should have left 5 minutes. I'm 2 minutes above the timing, but basically just to conclude, a methodology to estimate G multipliers, maybe the notation hopefully made you think about a paper or a setup where these assumptions could be satisfied and you could sort of apply this just in a straightforward manner. We used it to, in particular, estimate credit multipliers and show and see how they behave in the data. We use sort of as a motivation, sort of a class or regional version of the Kiyosaki-Moore model. And we seem to find G effects that are sort of very important, at least during the early 2000s housing boom in these data sets. Thanks a lot for all the questions and for the time, and happy to take more questions in the minutes that are left.
Thank you very much, Andres. I think we have some extra time for questions or comments, so please just jump in.
Sorry that I have to run also in the last bit.
Okay, so I'm gonna do something quick myself. Okay, so
Sure.
Carlos.
Yes.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Carlos.
sorry. I was thinking about the conclusions in Sarto's about the general equilibrium multipliers. So in the peer effects and group literature, like for the qualitative data, the identification part is even easier because the discrete choice models or the categorical choice models are non-linear, right? So you have this non-linearity that helps to identify the peer effect impact. So I was wondering, well, perhaps you can extend this to non-linear models quite easily.
So so let me first give the correct 100% correct answer, which is I don't know. Now let me give you the more speculative answer, which is, in my experience, the nonlinear specifications usually tend to be harder on the identification requirements that they have. This might be something related to kind of the macro type setups that I usually look into. I might be missing something from the more sort of applied labor literature, looking at peer effects and so on. So yeah, I mean, my speculation would be that this is harder. It's harder in identification assumptions. It's also harder on the power that you get for the estimates that you define. So I think there are many kind of obstacles in a sense of going non-linear most of the time that in my kind of mind are sort of more troublesome to deal with than the linear methods or the linear setups. But I might be wrong. There might be cases where this is actually not the case, and they're much simpler to deal with. So I wouldn't discard that either. Yeah.
We have a question from the attendees. So if Sophia could, okay. Now I believe it's Juan Francisco. I think you could speak yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Ernesto. Just a quick question. I was wondering if you have thought of applying your methodology to evaluate the general equilibrium effects of COVID-related credit programs that affect the value of collateral, and also they have an effect on the financing of banks, given that
sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
So
sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Yeah.
If you have thought of evaluating the general equilibrium effects of the credit programs in the environment of COVID. That's the question.
Right. Right. So I haven't, of course, I have speculated about that. I haven't done it actually done it. So I don't want to. What I do want to say, my feeling is that it's going to be hard to find a setup that works, at least to what I have shown you here, because I kind of have the feeling that the exclusion restrictions are going to be very hard to satisfy in general. Of course, empirically minded people are always very creative, so I'm sure someone will find sort of arguments probably to do something along these lines, and we might then sort of estimate multipliers in that setup as well. But at least for what I have thought about at this point, I feel it's going to be hard to do it. But yeah, it might be possible, definitely. But yeah, sorry not to give you some more sort of concrete answer.
Thank you. I have some quick question.
Sure.
Do you have any experience that you can tell us the results in some Monte Carlo experiments where you start up with a model, generate some model-generated data, and then apply the methodology to try to check whether it can catch up the G effects and all the questions that you had during the talk and maybe in other talks too?
That's a very good question. So actually in the Monte Carlo that I have, I didn't show you because I didn't want the table to be sort of horrible to look at. But in this setup, so you can sort of see here, the regional one is very precisely, particularly if you're using something between 50 states or, between MSAs or commuting zone level data. And of course, if you're using county level data, so you already get very precisely estimated regional elasticities, and you could lower the cross-sectional units to be 10 per group or per region and so on, and this wouldn't change a lot. The partial equilibrium effects are also very precisely estimated. I'm not showing them here again because I didn't want to sort of include 2 more columns and so on, but they are very precisely estimated here. So this could be one setup in which, messing up a little bit the identification that you get, the specification that you use sort of leads to huge biases, even for a sort of low level of phi, whereas the sort of correct, quote unquote, for the setup estimators work very, very well. So I would say, as long as, of course, the identification assumptions are satisfied, but as long as you're using, even MSA level data is already, I think, fine for these studies most of the time. There might be times where there's not a lot of variation left when you remove sort of the regional variation, so you have to be careful there. And there are definitely, some probably concerns on some of the variables. In these great markets that we have looked at, we don't have strong concerns on that front, but that could potentially be something to look at. And that kind of goes back to sort of the empirical design and, making sure that you truly have, different sources of variation, in a sense, at different levels. In terms of this Monte Carlo simulation, meaning that you have kind of a meaningful regional source of variation, a meaningful sort of idiosyncratic source of variation as well. Yeah.